Hey everyone, it's Andrew Nagel, Valk9 Designs again, and we are back to do the bottom detailing on this Tree of Life piece. We're going to put a thicker coil around the cabochon that is set in the bottom of the pendant. I'm going to be using 21 gauge half-hard square wire for the base wire on the coil. We're going to be using 22 gauge half-hard round wire for the coiled wire, and then we're going to be using 30 gauge round wire dead soft for the outermost detailing wire on this coil. So to get started with my coil, I cut off a length of my 21G square. I want to make sure that this length of wire is going to be able to go all the way around the cabochon. So I'm just going to kind of lay it next to my piece and see how long of a length I'm going to need, and then cut it off. I'm going to do the same thing with the 22 gauge round wire. Now it's really hard to be able to gauge how much wire you're going to need for the coil, and so I just like to wing it with each length. I'm going to be using probably about 1.5 feet of the 22 gauge round for the coiled wire on this coil. One thing that I like to utilize for the extra length of wire that spins around when I make the coil is cup handles. You know, on like your mugs or something like that. I also kind of just, I'll show you here later in the video how I build it, but I also kind of just let that piece of wire spin freely underneath my desk as I spin my coil. So to start this coil off, we're going to be taking the end of our 22 round and we're going to wrap it with the 30 gauge round wire. Continue coiling the 22 gauge wire with the 30 gauge wire until you've gotten to the end of your 30 gauge. Sometimes I prefer to just clip off this little tail because it just gets really annoying trying to get it wrapped all the way around the wire. Once you've got about 1 inch of the 30 gauge coiled onto your 22 gauge, you're ready to start your coil on the base wire. Go ahead and take your 21 gauge square wire and wrap your 22 gauge coil around your base wire. I've left about 1.5 inches of the 22 gauge round exposed, so that way I can kind of create just a little bit more of a different texture on this end of the coil. Feel free to do that. You don't have to. You can just make this a coil all the way up if you want to on your piece. Take your pliers and squeeze those together to make sure everything's uniform. Once it's all nice and tight, you're ready to start your coil. Now I've shown this to my Patreon members before, but I've wanted to re-demonstrate this for a while. What I like to do is pinch the 22 gauge wire between my index and my thumb, and I kind of let the rest of it, I kind of let the extra length of that wire sit in the little nook between my middle finger and my pointer finger. And then I also pinch the 30 gauge between my index and my thumb. And I have that 22 gauge kind of sit, you know, on the top of the pinch, and I use the 21 gauge as a lever, as you can see there, to coil the 30 gauge onto the 22 gauge round wire. This is kind of a further away view. The camera was just a bit too close for me to go the normal speed. But as you can see, I use this pinch method to make my coils, and it's made coil making a lot faster. If you use a drill, you know, by all means, continue to use a drill to make your coils. This is just how I make mine. I don't think either way is right or wrong. You know, it's just whatever you prefer and whatever works best for you. Make sure you push your 30 gauge, compress it back against that base wire so that way everything is nice and tight. And as I'm getting this coil started, I like to use my pliers to, start to coil that wire, or the 22 wire, onto the base wire. Once you get enough of the coils going, you'll have a section that you can grip and you can start to twist the rest of your coil onto your base wire. Keep spinning around that base wire and you'll continue feeding the length of your 30 gauge onto your 22 gauge, and this will continue building the coil. Then after you start to get enough of a length onto the coil, you'll be ready to start shaping it along your frame so that way you can see how long of a coil to make. Laying that against the frame. Now I can see where I want to bend the coil and how much further along the base wire that I need to go. I'm going to give that a nice angle right there. And then we'll continue on along down the coil. This part is sped up a little bit. I don't actually move that fast. I do wish I could. Again, we're using that pinch method and we're just twisting on more of that 30 gauge onto the 22. Once we make it long enough, we're ready to form the bend at the bottom of the cabochon. I'm just doing one easy bend, just like that. Pretty simple. We'll tighten the point up a little bit, and we're ready to continue on. Once you're near the top and you've made your final bend, you're ready to finish on the rest of the coil and tie down the 22 wire. I need just a little bit more of a coil on mine. Then we're ready to tie this thing down. I'm cutting off my 30 gauge. Sometimes I would use it as the detailing wire back down the coil, but I'm going to be using a length of 26 gauge round to do that part of the detail. Once you've clipped off the length of 22 that you don't need, we're ready to attach our final detail onto the coil. As I said, we're going to be using 26 gauge round to finish this coil off. You don't have to do this part of the coil detail, but I just kind of prefer to. It seems to just make a nice finished product for myself. Starting off with the 26 gauge, I'm going to wrap it around a couple of sections of coil and then down the base. Go ahead and tighten that up. And then we're ready to start feeding our 26 into the little groove that's between each of those coils. Having a hard time getting that camera to focus on this coil. There we go, it's a bit better. But as you can see, I'm just feeding that 26G in between those little nooks between each of the coiled spots. Continue that process all the way down the coil. Sometimes it's easier to do this before you've bent the coil, and if it's easier for you to do that before you've bent the coil, do so. And then kind of the same thing at the end here. You can make that 26 G sit between those grooves on the 22G tie down point. And then once you've got that nice and tight, you're ready to attach this coil to the frame. We're going to straighten out a couple of these parts here. Bring in that coil a little bit, tighten up that bend. Bending in those ends of the coil a little bit more, just to align them with that top part of the cabochon, and to bring those points into where we want them to be for the tie down. Bending the ends of the base wire back, we're going to feed them through to the back of the frame and then back up and attach them kind of near the base of the tree. At least that's where I'm going to on my frame. Attach it wherever is most convenient on your frame, and whatever keeps it, the closest to the tie down spot. If you pull that back into the wire, across the frame and then try to tie it down somewhere far away from that bend, then it's going to create, a stretch of wire on the back, and that's not really what you want to do to keep a tight tie down point. You want to tie it down as close as possible to where the detailing bends up and through the frame. Some adjustments there. The other thing I'm going to do after attaching my other end to the frame in the same fashion, I'm going to tie down this this bottom point with some half hard wire. So after you've attached both of your coil points to the frame, go ahead and feed some 20 gauge half hard. That's what I used. 20 gauge half hard, half round. Or you could use, 22 gauge half hard, or you could use round wire. It doesn't have to be half round. That's just what I like to use when I'm tying down coils and wires as such. And then I fed those through to the back, and then I'm going to tie them down to the frame. Always clip off any extras. That'll make it a lot easier to work with the wire. If you're not trying to force so much material through those tiny slots, it's a bit easier. And tie that end of wire all the way down to the frame. Now you can tie down your other end and secure your coil to the frame. Now we're ready to start on the kind of finer detailing on this inner part between the cabochon and the outside coil. I'm going to be using a length of 13 gauge dead soft half round wire. I'm feeding that through the frame near the top of the opening where that coil bends, and I'm tying it down directly to the outer part of the frame, as you can see here. Then once I've secured that to the frame, I bend the 13 gauge wire down so that way the, dome part is facing up. And I basically just form it along the entire length of the coil and the cabochon, keeping it, keeping it as straight lines to accentuate the coil. This is another great spot where those nylon pliers come in handy, because as you're bending this wire at sharp angles like this, it likes to kind of twist and flex and stuff, and so having the nylon pliers helps you flatten down the point as you work with it. We're going to continue that wire along the length of the coil. And another suggestion for this is to shape this wire up and not attach it, but to, have a length of that wire, I'd say about 8 inches or so, and fold it right in the center and make that V shape, and then form your top folds, and then, attach it to the frame that way. I ran into a slight difficulty having that one end already attached, but, we make do. I also think it'd be easier to have it kind of loose at this stage where we attach the next section, but I made it work either way. What I'm going to do is send my length of 20 gauge sterling silver wire. I use so many different gauges in this piece. By the end of it, we're going to have gone through literally every gauge on my bench, which is kind of awesome actually. And so after we send that tip through, I'm going to attach it again directly to the frame, so that way I can manipulate the wire from that point. Make sure it's nice and tied down. And then we're going to shape it on the top to run along this extra length of 13 gauge half round, bending it to, shape it with the cabochon. I want it to be the same height as well, so as you can see, I brought it kind of straight up and bent it down at the same height that my 13 gauge is sitting at, so that way they're sitting flat, they're sitting at the same level. I'm just kind of inching it back there so that way that back point comes, close up to the folded down point of the 13 gauge half round that goes into the frame. Now that we've got those lined up there, we're ready to attach the 30 gauge wire that I'm going to be using to bring these together. Go ahead and wrap it a good 4 or 5 times around and feed that 30 gauge all the way down to the base of the 20 gauge the 20 gauge square wire. Once you get that tie down point kind of pushed down in there, so that way it's nestled into the rest of the wires, we're going to start doing a little bit of a weave pattern here. Start weaving your 30 gauge wire between your 13 gauge half round and your 20 gauge square wire. Again, you don't have to use these gauges. You can use whatever gauges you have on hand. You don't even have to use half round for that larger outside wire. You could just use another length of square if that's all that you have on hand. We're going to build a weave between this little open section here to, close up that spot and to secure these two wires together. So I keep bending that wire open, so that way as I build this weave, I keep that section open and I don't, tie it completely closed in that little section. I want that little expanded weave part right there. Continue on this pattern as you progress your weave. Going back and forth, crossing from over and under and over and under. Until you get that weave to come to a point where the two wires come very close together, and then you can start to build off of one side or the other. I'm going to demonstrate for you the weave pattern that I chose to do on this section. You don't have to do the same pattern. You can do whichever one you want. But basically I'm going to start feeding my 30 gauge around that length on the innermost part. So on the 20 gauge square, I'm going to continue just going around that and around that. Then I'm eventually going to go around both wires to bring them together again. Now when I do this, I'm not weaving between them, but instead I'm going around both of them from the bottom. I'm going to go 3 times around on this first section, then I'm going to continue back down on the bottom, and then once I get a little bit further down, I'm going to do 4 times around both of them, and then continue back on the bottom. Continue wrapping your silver around that, what is our 20 gauge square wire. And then we're going to start weaving between the two wires again once we've gone about another centimeter down the length. Going to go from the bottom wire to the top 13 gauge wire, wrap twice around the top 13 gauge wire, then back down to the 20 gauge wire square, and wrap twice around that, and then back up, and vice versa. You're going to go back and forth until you've done 3 sections of 2 wraps on the 13 gauge wire, and then back down to the bottom one. Then we're going to continue on with the bottom, creating that little weave there. We're going to continue wrapping that around the 20 gauge wire until we get to the point where we're ready to tie this down to the frame. Go ahead and clip off your 30 gauge. Clip off your extra length of 20 gauge. And then you can lift that up. Just be very careful here so that way you don't rip your weave. And try to feed that tip through to the back. And again, try to make sure that you keep those two wires even as you tie it down. Go ahead and tie down that wire to the back frame. And then, once you've secured your two wires down, you're ready to do that to the other side, and we're going to continue the exact same pattern, just, repeating up the other side. When you finish doing that detailing on the left side, then you're ready to clip your extra ends and feed them through to the back and attach them to the frame. I'm attaching them in a extremely similar fashion to what I had going on the other side, as in the same bars and the same points, just on the opposite side of the frame. Now that your ends are all attached, you're ready to put on the final detailing that will encompass the entire coil. We've got all our tie downs ready to rock and roll, and we're going to put on the final detailing. We're going to be using one final length of 18 gauge Argentium wire. I don't always use Argentium on the outside, but I like the 18 gauge size, and so I thought this would be a good size to do this final detailing with. Attach your 18 gauge to one side of the coil near the top. And after you've attached it, go ahead and start bending that wire along the coil length. Go ahead and do a curved bend along with the coil. Sometimes I'll do a super pointed bend with this outermost wire, but I think we'll just keep it kind of curved with the coil. and that sits really nicely between the frame and the coil, so I think that'll just work very well. Bring it back down the other side. Continue forming your outer detailing wire. Bring it up that left side and form your final bend. Clip off any extras you don't need. And you're ready to tuck your tip back into the frame and connect it to the frame. Go ahead and tie down your ends and you're ready to rock and roll. I had to make one final adjustment over on the right side here. It wasn't sitting exactly as I needed it to. And then voila, once you've connected those ends, you are ready to rock and roll. I hope this has helped you all figure out some ideas on what to do with the detailing and the roots of your tree pieces. Again, switch it up if you want to. You don't have to do exactly what I'm doing in this tutorial. But yeah, if you guys think you've come up with something cool, go ahead and send me some photos and your ideas and stuff. I hope this was informational for you and that you're enjoying this tutorial so far. Please let me know any comments, questions, or concerns in the comment section. And yeah, I hope you all have a great day and keep creating. We will be back with the upper detailing in part 7 of this tutorial. Thank you so much and have an amazing weekend, everyone.